Christ is in our midst. Good morning, Kalimera. So today we read the epistle reading from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And as you may know, St. Paul was basically an itinerant preacher. So he traveled around the known world and he'd stop in places and preach the gospel. And in the case of Corinth, he spent about a year and a half there preaching. But then he moves on. Wherever he goes, he stays for a little bit, plants a church, and then goes somewhere else. But he keeps in touch with his churches through correspondence, through people that are traveling around. So he hears what's going on. And this letter, St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, is a letter where St. Paul is responding to a variety of concerns, questions, confusions that the church in Corinth is having. In particular, one of the big ones, and this was something that was sort of near and dear to St. Paul's heart, was the questioning of the legitimacy of St. Paul's ministry. Right? So there was a group in Corinth that basically felt that St. Paul wasn't a legitimate apostle. They thought he was sort of less than an apostle. He didn't preach well. He didn't take money from them, which is what we're going to talk about today. But there were a variety of things he declined doing because of his love for Christ that made him sort of a suspicious or a suspect apostle to at least a group of people in the church of Corinth. Now today in particular, we hear about this idea of supporting the pastor, the church supporting the pastor financially. And I'll read a little bit of it today, and I'm going to repeat myself, but he says, quote, "Do we," and this is Paul and Barnabas it would appear, "do we not have the right to our food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a wife, as the other apostles and the brother of the Lord and Cephas," which is St. Peter, "or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living?" And what he's implying there is that they weren't taking money from the church in Corinth, and so they had to work with their own hands to make money to feed themselves and take care of themselves. And then he says, "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense?" It's kind of a rhetorical question, the answer being no one. "Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit?" Again, no one. "Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk?" Again, no one. Now, I want to take a minute and just sort of take apart what St. Paul is saying here. He basically has three arguments that he uses to sort of explain that it is the responsibility of the church in Corinth to take care of it, right? He starts out by simply pointing to the other disciples, right? He uses them as an example. He says, quote, as I said a moment ago, "Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a wife as the other apostles?" So he points to the other apostles and says, they have a wife. Can't we have one too? "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living?" So he opens up by simply using other apostles whom they would know as examples of why it is appropriate and right, and even we should say expected, for the church in Corinth to support Paul. Then he moves on to what we might call a common sense argument, which we heard a second ago. And basically he says, hey, if you're a soldier in the army, you don't have to work part-time to support yourself so that you can eat and drink and have a roof over your head. And he says, if you're a man who plants a vineyard, right? You don't plant the vineyard without taking some of the grapes from the vineyard. And again, he talks about a shepherd, right? And if you have sheep, you don't just take care of them without benefiting from the milk and the other things that sheep produce, right? So that's his second argument. He starts by talking about the other disciples. He then talks about these common sense arguments. And finally, he actually uses a very interesting last argument. And that is an argument from the Old Testament, right? Actually, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25. And he says the following. He says, "Do I say this on human authority?" He says, "Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses," this is from Deuteronomy 25, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not speak entirely for our sake? It is written for our sake. So St. Paul is basically looking back at this Old Testament passage. It's amazing how well he must have known the Old Testament to be able to pull that verse out. What an obscure verse. And he says, this passage is not about oxen. Right? And what he's saying is that if you're going to work the oxen, what the Old Testament is saying, if you're going to work the oxen and they're going to be producing all this food for you, you should at least let them nibble a little bit as they're doing their work, right? They go and they grind the oxen and they can reach down and have a little bit of the grain, right? That's what it's saying. But what Paul is saying is that this isn't even written for the oxen. This was written for him and for this situation, for those who basically make their living preaching the gospel, as was the case with St. Paul. And he says that as the oxen isn't to be muzzled while treading out the grain, we also need to support whoever it is that is preaching and teaching the gospel to us, right? That's what he's saying to the church in Corinth. And ultimately, he's saying this to simply say that he has this right. He has the right to be supported by the church that he teaches and preaches and pastors. That's his main point. But, and this is an important point, he does not exercise this right. He chooses not to exercise this right. And here's what he says. He says, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. And really the backstory on that is that in the Old Testament, basically in Paul's time, if you were sort of a teacher, I believe there were basically 4 ways you could make a living, right? You could do what Paul does, which is work, which is also sort of the least respected way to do it. You could beg. There was actually, I think it was the Cynics, that would actually beg on street corners, which of course was unusual and not respected. You could find a wealthy homeowner and become sort of his in-house scholar, or you could charge students to teach them, right? And St. Paul didn't want to do any of those first two because he was concerned that in doing that, first of all, he would sort of make his own ministry seem a little suspect, right? Maybe he's telling them what they want to hear, right? And second of all, he didn't want them to think that he was only doing it for their money, right? So rather than put an obstacle in the gospel, in the way of the gospel, as St. Paul says, he works with his own hands. So now I want to take a minute and apply this to us. And I want to do it in two ways. First, the first application is the issue of financial support for those whose primary work is the spreading of the gospel. And here I have sort of 2 points, sort of 2 underpoints under this heading. The first actually relates to me as the priest, as the pastor, right? And it dawned on me that if we make our living from the gospel, then we have to be very careful as pastors, as priests, as ministers, that we question ourselves time and again as to what we are preaching, right? Are we preaching things that want to be heard by the people around us? Are we failing to preach the harder words, right? The harder lessons that the gospel has to say. Right, so that's point number 1, and that's more for me than for you. But secondly, and this is a point for you and not for me, for those of us who support the ministry, right, those of us who functionally pay the salary, the roof over the head of the minister, we have to ask, I would say, 2 questions. First, we have to ask ourselves, do we like what we hear, or do we not like what we hear? And if we like what we hear, then we have to ask the question, do we like it because the priest is telling us what we want to hear? In which case, that's not a good thing. And if we don't like what we hear, then we have to ask one of 2 questions, right? Do we not like it because it's wrong, right? Is the preacher, in fact, wrongly teaching us? In which case, it's incumbent on us to approach the pastor, the minister, the priest, and say, hey, Mr. Minister, I don't think this is right, and here's why. Or, and this is, I think, more often the case, do we not like what we're hearing because it pokes as something we don't want to look at in our lives. Right? And if that's the case, then rather than looking at the priest, what we need to do is we need to find a mirror. And we need to look at the person in the mirror and ask that person what's going on in that person's heart. So that's number one, is this issue of financial support of the minister. The second thing, which St. Paul says, to some extent here, but to a greater extent elsewhere in the epistle of 1 Corinthians, is the issue of rights. Now, I have a story, many of you have probably heard my story, from the life of an elder in Greece, Elder Epiphanios Theodoropoulos, and he had a saying, and the saying was the following. He said, when we are single, we have rights and responsibilities. When we marry, we have fewer rights and more responsibilities. And when we have children, we have no rights at all. We only have responsibilities, right? And I'm sure any of us who have kids know the truth of that statement. But I bring it up because as Christians, we are not about rights, right? A mature Christian knows that it's not about my demanding what's coming to me. I mean, marriage is a perfect example, right? Where if we go into marriage expecting our spouse to do this and to do that and to be home and it's not going to end well. But ultimately, that is the whole message of the gospel. St. Paul, I'll read a passage. This wasn't from our reading today. It's a few verses later. But St. Paul speaks of this himself. He says, for though I am free from all men, so he's free, right? I have made myself a slave to all that I might win the more, right? So the gospel, the message of the gospel, is not about rights, right? Christ didn't demand rights on the cross, right? If he wanted his rights, he wouldn't have been up on the cross. Ultimately, as Christians, we struggle not for rights, but to bear the burden of our neighbor. Right? That's what the Christian faith is about. And so, brothers and sisters in Christ, may we, as we continue the service and eventually go about our way this week, may we look into our hearts and make sure that they are right and they are in order. And may we make sure also that rather than demanding things as Christians, right, as our witness to the world around us, may we be people that don't demand our rights, but rather demand the responsibilities and take on the burdens of those around us. Amen.